Okay, so a while back, I saw someone had made a comment on one of the Neural DSP Facebook groups about using ChatGPT to help them create presets on the quad cortex. And that's always kind of been in the back of my mind as something I wanted to try. And recently I got a comment, a request come in for a preset that was around kind of the tones of the Scorpions, specifically around the song No One Like You and Still Loving You. I figured, let's combine those two together and let's see what ChatGPT can come up with. So I went to ChatGPT. You can see here, I'm using the 4.0 model. And I started out by just asking about, who were the guitarists in the Scorpions. And, they brought back, a few players. If you look at the history of the Scorpions, you can see they've had tons of different musicians kind of come through. But it did correctly, I think, identify, some of the key ones that have been in the band. And so then I asked, well, who played on the song Still Loving You and No One Like You? And they brought in, the two main guitarists who were in the band at that time and which album they were on. And so then I started asking, well, what kind of guitar equipment did those two guitarists use on those albums? And they went into, a lot of detail around kind of the guitars and the amplifiers and the effects. It seemed to be pulling in a lot of good information. And so then I said, well, can you generate the settings for a preset for the Neural DSP quad cortex to replicate that equipment and the sounds and tones of those guitarists on those songs? And this is what I came up with. If we see here, it talks about using the rhythm guitar tone. We're using a Marshall JCM 800. So it didn't identify the name of what the JCM 800 on the quad cortex is. It just says the quad cortex includes models that closely mimic the JCM 800, and it does. And it gives you some of the settings to use. It talks about the type of cab to use. It talks about the reverb and the EQ. And then it talks about the lead guitar tone. It gives you different amp settings. It talks about, again, the cabinet and mic. It talks about different delay and reverb settings. It talks about a chorus, adding EQ. And then it talks about its signal chain, which I thought was interesting. It talks about the blocks and the input block first and the output block last. The order of the blocks is kind of interesting. It's not the order I would typically do these in. Typically, I would run the EQ probably before the amp or pretty soon after it. I would usually run chorus, then delay, then reverb. So it was an interesting kind of order. And we'll start with this, but we'll play around with it. So I thought it did a pretty thorough job of kind of explaining a lot of the key elements of how to create the preset. And then, it said chorus, and I was like, well, what chorus effect would work best? And went into this whole thing about using analog versus digital. And it did say to kind of use something that was like a Boss CE1. So that one is available in the quad cortex. So we would just use that. And then I asked for the clean tones. Do the amp settings change? Are they achieving a clean tone by rolling off the guitar? They said the cleaner sections are achieved by rolling off the guitar volume. And then they did give me alternative amp settings for doing a clean tone, which we can try out as well, and we can kind of see how that goes. And then I asked, for the EQ boost at 1.2 kilohertz, how many dB should the boost be? It says 2 to 4. It says start with a 3. So I thought I was giving pretty good answers to the questions I was asking to kind of delve into some of the details. So I thought it was a really interesting experience to kind of go through this asking, ChatGPT on how to build this out. And I don't know, I may be out of a job. I mean, if next time you guys are looking for a preset that is kind of mimicking a certain guitarist, start with ChatGPT and see what you get. So let's go ahead and jump over to the Cortex control. And I've created a preset pretty much exactly like ChatGPT has told me to do. So we've got the input block. I'm going with their order. So I've got amp, cab. I've got the plate reverb for the rhythm tone. We've got a hall reverb for the lead tone. We've got a digital delay for the lead tone. We've got a chorus. And we've got an EQ here where we're pushing the 1200 hertz frequency about 4 dB. And so I've set up some scenes here. The first is a rhythm, and it's really just the Marshall into the plate reverb with the EQ on the 4x12. Now I did add a high pass filter of 120 hertz like they asked, And I added a low pass filter of 6,000 hertz as well, just to, again, roll off some of the top end. And we're using a Dynamic 57 and a ribbon mic. Again, they talked about using both of those mics as well, so let's hear what it sounds like. So a good kind of standard Marshall rhythm sound, but I think it works. The guitar I'm using is a HSS Strat style guitar. The pickup in the bridge is not super hot, and I think you'd probably be pushing the amp a little more if you had a hotter pickup. So one thing we could do is we could just go ahead and just pump up the gain by just a little bit on the input. Maybe go ahead and I think that might be the best way to do it. So we can also add a chorus to that, and this is where the settings the ChatGPT generated for the chorus is pretty mellow, and it's not a very present chorus effect in the tone. It's really just supposed to thicken it up. And this is more for if you're doing a clean tone, I really roll it down to about 6. The other option is, the clean settings they gave us of having the gain lower. I've got the output a little too high on that. I think you could use a little more low end. And mids. I think I would probably use the rolled off volume more. I think it's right. I think that's typically the way it would do, but it's interesting to have both. And then for the lead, we're pushing up the gain and we're switching to the hall reverb into the digital delay, and then we're adding in that boost around the 1200 hertz. And it sounds like this. Pushing that 1 hertz just a little bit too much. Let's start out. We'll bring it back to 3. So again, pretty close. We could add the chorus to that. So that's what ChatGPT kind of recommended. So the way I would typically do this, if we think about kind of reordering these things, is I would probably put the EQ up front. And then I would move the chorus in front there and put the delay in front of the reverbs. And it would be more like this. Let's go ahead and try the chorus rhythm. So, overall, so one thing I would probably do different is I likely would not use a digital delay for the lead. I'd probably use an analog delay, but that's just personal preference, and we'll just stick with what ChatGPT had. So, this is, I think, not a bad start. If you were ever looking to create a preset that mimics a certain artist's tone, I think starting with ChatGPT seems like it's a pretty good, starting point. And then you can tweak as you go. If we went back to ChatGPT and just did something that said, I don't know, create the best sounding guitar preset for the neural DSP quad Cortex. Let's see what it does. So it seems to like Fender and Marshall. If you look at it here, it wants to use an overdrive as a boost rather than for additional distortion. Set up clean and high gain amps in parallel paths. Assign foot switch toggle between the clean and high gain settings. So there's a lot of detail here. It's a pretty straightforward, just kind of dual amp preset with a Fender amp and a Marshall amp. It's pretty straightforward, but I thought it gives you a lot of detail. You can maybe ask it to change something. Can you give me the settings if I wanted to change the Marshall? If I could type JCM 800 for a EVH 5150. So a lot of good information there. And again, I think especially if you're just kind of getting started with how to use these kind of modelers, here's a good way to do it. I think you can, hey, what about this? What about this? And it's going to give you, I think, kind of the standard best practice for using some of these amps and some of these pieces. So I would encourage you guys to try it out if you haven't been using ChatGPT in this way, in the comments below, let me know what kind of results you're getting. I've been really impressed with this level of detail, and although nothing it's telling you here, I would say is revolutionary, obviously, it's all just kind of based on what it's finding on the internet. I think it's a pretty good baseline for a lot of these tones. I was impressed. I took the exact settings that it told me for the Scorpion stuff, moved it into a preset, and it sounded good out of the box. And all I could do then is just tweak a few things. So again, I'd encourage you to check it out. And as always, thanks for watching.